What do you get when you mix yellow plaid with a big black horse and a cherry tree? Well, apparently you get a new musical adaptation of the 90s classic, Clueless. The true fangirlies will already know that Dove Cameron already starred in an off-Broadway version back in 2018, which featured a lot of songs from the 80s and the 90s. Now, I don't know if the link to the pre-existing songs was a bit too much of a stretch at points, or perhaps paying the copyright fees made the show not very lucrative, but Heckerling, the writer of both the Clueless film and musical, has decided to give the show's London transfer an original new score. And she hired none other than Scottish singer-songwriter Katie Tunstall for the job. Yes. Quite a drastic change, I would say, from 80s, 90s sounds to Scottish folk music. But it turns out this isn't Tunstall's first musical adaptation rodeo. Back in 2022, Tunstall already wrote the score for Saving Grace, a musical adaptation of the eponymous 2000 film, which I had never heard of, to be honest. Neither of the film or the musical. So even though I can't find a source to confirm my hunch, my bet is that Heckerling heard the soundtrack for Saving Grace, really connected to the score, and therefore decided to work with Katie Tunstall over a more established musical theatre writer. Or perhaps it was just networking that brought them together. Anywho, this announcement made me realize that recently quite a few pop stars have ventured into the musical theatre stratosphere, and it has made me reflect upon whether or not I like this trend. But to talk about this topic accurately, we first have to place it in its historical context. Popular music and musical theatre have always been heavily intertwined. A lot of early MT songs actually became jazz standards, such as The Lady's a Tramp and My Funny Valentine, both from the show Babe in Arms, written by Richard Rodgers. In the 60s, famous musical theatre songs would top the charts, and later on developments in popular music, such as the use of synths or rock guitars, would in turn get incorporated into musicals. Think of the Phantom of the Opera, for example. The line became even blurrier with the introduction of jukebox musicals, where a musical essentially gets reverse engineered by taking an existing score of an artist, or in the case of the 2018 Clueless musical adaptation, the songs of a specific era, and fabricating a story around that. The standard jukebox musical that is imprinted into our zeitgeist is, to my horror, definitely Mamma Mia. I'm personally not a big fan of jukebox musicals. I think they're a big reason why the general public views musical theatre as cringy, but perhaps I'll get more into that in a future video. What these developments to the musical theatre landscape brought about is that more so than ever it became clear that musical theatre doesn't have one particular sound, but encompasses a lot of different genres. Musical theatre is a medium, not a genre. What I mean by that is that musical theatre is a subcategory of the umbrella medium theatre, with its distinction that characters now also sing and sometimes even dance to progress the story. So just like how in theatre you have comedies, dramas, period pieces, musical theatre also tells a vast array of different stories. And because the characters are now singing and dancing, the music is a very important part of telling that story. The score of, for example, an upbeat comedy that is set in the 60s will sound very different to a contemporary drama. There are legit musicals, rock musicals, pop musicals, jazz musicals. The list goes on and on. That's why it really does my head in when people say they don't like musicals. It's such a blanket statement to cover such a wide variety of shows. I have to agree that there is a somewhat typical musical theatre sound that I can conjure up in my brain when I think of musicals. You know, perhaps it's a bit more cheesy or, slightly too dramatic. And I completely understand if that's not your cup of tea. But like I said, not all musical theatre shows sound like that. So don't throw away the whole repertoire simply because you don't like one genre, is what I'm saying. Now, with this distinction in mind, it does make a lot of sense for musical theatre writers to have all sorts of backgrounds. Of course, The Music for Once, a musical about a busker in Dublin, is written by an artist who started his career by busking in Dublin. Talk about authenticity. But what about stories that don't necessarily scream a specific genre of music? Diane Paulus, director of the musical Waitress, deliberately put a creative team together who hadn't worked on Broadway yet, stating she wanted a more contemporary sensibility. Interesting statement in my opinion. It's not like the two are mutually exclusive, I would say, but okay. I guess she just needed a breath of fresh air. Funnily enough though, she was inspired to work with Sara Bareilles because of her extraordinary ballads like Gravity, but Sara is actually a musical theatre kid. She spent a lot of her childhood years on stage in local community productions together with her mother and sister. She says she was obsessed with the sound of music and that musical theatre was her first genre of music that she fell in love with. So Sara clearly doesn't really understand the difference between medium and genre either, but I'm assuming she's alluding to that typical classic musical theatre sound. I think it's so fascinating that Diane Paulus, a seasoned Broadway director, without knowing it, picked out an artist who actually had musical theatre roots. She must have subconsciously picked up on something. And boy did it pay off. Despite Sara describing writing for Waitress as something that felt slightly bigger than what she could manage, the show went on to receive multiple Tony and Olivier nominations. And I'm convinced that a large part of that success, despite Sara being a newcomer to Broadway, is rooted in the fact that she has a musical theatre background. Stating, "I'm very aware that I'm stepping into some sacred ground here and wanting to do right by the legacy that's been set before me. It's a genre I love and have respect for, but I also want to feel like I can tip my hat to what has come before, but also make the storytelling my own." I mean, is there a more perfect mindset? But so does that mean that every pop star who wants to write a musical have to have portrayed a Von Trapp at some point in their childhood? Not necessarily. With Dolly Parton being the writer of the iconic 9 to 5 song for the 1980s film, naturally the creators of the Broadway adaptation thought of her to complete the rest of the score. The country singer did admit that she didn't see that many Broadway musicals before, but that she grew up watching films like Oklahoma and State Fair. So yet again, she was exposed to musical theatre from a young age. Just like Waitress, this musical written by a pop star ended with loads of nominations during award season. And rightfully so. I think we've all cried our eyes out belting "Get Out and Stay Out" on a lonely Friday evening. A huge part of that success is the fact that the rest of the creative team were musical theatre veterans who were very involved in the creation process of the music. Parton said, "I was more than happy to adjust and adapt to anything they needed me to change. I didn't take it as an insult as a writer. I thought, well, this is what they do, they should know." Again, such an open, ego-free way of collaborating. We love to see it. Dolly seemed to have caught the musical theatre bug as she recently announced an autobiographical musical named Hello, I'm Dolly to come to Broadway in 2026. I don't think it really comes as a surprise to anyone that this larger-than-life lady has a natural knack for musical theatre. She already oozes so much theatricality just by being herself, which clearly lends itself very well to this new venture. Speaking of oozing theatricality, Sir Elton John entered the musical theatre realm pretty much the same way Dolly Parton did. Longtime collaborator of Andrew Lloyd Webber, Tim Rice, invited John to work on the Lion King movie with him, and just like that, he became the writer of the highest grossing Disney property until Frozen came along. Naturally, him and Rice decided to join forces again, but this time they weren't interested in an animated movie, so Disney let them create a musical directly for the stage. And thus, Aida was born, another immensely successful musical. After that, he took on 2 more musicals. He's unstoppable. The first one was an adaptation of the Vampire Chronicles called Lestat, which closed after only a month. The second one became his third bullseye, Billy Elliot. It's so interesting to see how the same writer can bomb this hard with one project while soaring so high with others. A notable difference is that he wrote Lestat with his pop writing partner Bernie Taupin, basically the first time he wrote without an MT guru to guide him. Proving yet again that above all, musical theatre is a team effort. His hits made Elton John the most successful composer working in musical theatre from 1994 to 2005. Not bad for someone who seemingly before 1991 had no experience with the medium. Elton John actually made a bit of a comeback last year with a new musical called Tammy Faye, which yet again was critically well received. His most recent project is the musical adaptation of The Devil Wears Prada, which is about to open in the West End, and I simply cannot wait to go. I will definitely post a video about it, so if you're as curious as I am, don't forget to subscribe. Right when you're thinking these pop stars seem to excel at writing musicals, I'm gonna bring up the mess that is Spiderman Turn Off the Dark. U2 frontman and lead guitarist Bono The Edge were brought on the project to write the music. From what I can tell, neither seemed to have any experience with musical theatre prior to this. Despite working with Julie Taymor, the director of The Lion King's stage adaptation, Spider-Man was a flop of gigantic proportions. The production did face a lot of difficulty with technical issues, injuries, and even a death, so we can't pinpoint this fail entirely on the music, but I have to say that when I read the music section of the Spider-Man Wikipedia page, I had a little giggle. The Edge said it had elements of rock and roll, circus, opera, and musical theatre. Bono, admitting that his description is a little pretentious, referred to it as pop-up pop art opera, and said that the director Julie Taymor called it a rock and roll circus drama. Sure. Paul Bogave ended up getting hired as a consultant to help improve the sound quality of the songs and numbers. Safe to say there were a lot of creative differences in the team. The New York Times said it ranked among the worst Broadway musicals ever, and the show ended up closing with a massive loss. Another iconic pop rock artist who absolutely stacked their musical theatre debut was Paul Simon. In 1998, the multi-Grammy Award-winning artist wrote The Capeman, a musical based on Puerto Rican gangster turned poet Salvador Agron. Despite having no prior experience with Broadway, Simon made rather ignorant statements calling it a stale musical form and that it had ended up in a weird cul-de-sac, probably because it was never energized by rock and roll. To which theatre producer Rocco Landsman responded, "The idea that you can at a strike rewrite an art form is a little presumptuous. I can't say the people in the theatre community were rooting for Paul Simon after all the things he said about Broadway." But don't you worry, our little Icarus fell down hard. The show closed after only 68 performances, and the Times' initial reviews said that it was like watching a mortally wounded animal. You're only sorry that it has to suffer and that there's nothing you can do about it. Yikes. The most recent example of this pipeline is singer Florence Welch of band Florence and the Machine, who made the plunge into musical theatre with Gatsby, an American myth. The singer was already linked to the Gatsby universe by contributing to the soundtrack of the 2013 film, but was now enrolled to write the entire score for the American Repertory Theatre production. So no, it's not the Broadway production featuring Jeremy Jordan and Ava Noblezada. It's the other one. Just like Sara Bareilles, Florence said in a press release that musical theatre was her first love. I think yet again no one's really surprised given the whimsy of this lady. She's working closely with director Rachel Chavkin, who directed Hadestown, so I think chances are high that this will be good. I unfortunately cannot find anything from the musical online, so unless someone has a good slime tutorial to share with me, I'll just have to keep praying for a London transfer. So despite Popstar's writing musicals for forever basically, I do think that there is a notable recent rise to be discussed, as I would love to know what motivated this wave. Has the shift from CD to streaming services resulted in such a financial dip that perhaps artists are more open to guaranteed paid sums for their writing work? Perhaps. It's interesting to note that Katie Tunstall in an interview said that she started writing musicals during the pandemic, a notoriously hard financial time for, well, I wanted to say creatives, but let's be honest, for everyone. But I think the more likely answer to this sudden surge is that producers have caught on that besides star casting the characters of their show, they can now also star cast their writers. It's very inspiring that Diane Paulus chose Sara Bareilles supposedly for her extraordinary ballads, but I'm pretty sure that the fact that Waitress grossed $1.2 million in ticket sales alone in one night when it was announced that Sara Bareilles was going to take on the lead part is a very nice bonus. Elton John single-handedly brought musical theatre back to the pop charts with Can You Feel the Love Tonight from Lion King and Written in the Stars from Aida, with apparently a music video which features John and Leanne Rimes serenading snow globes filled with nude, nippleless mermaids. I love this man. This type of cross-platform marketing is every producer's wet dream, but some do take it a bit too far. The score for the recent SpongeBob musical adaptation is written by Yolanda Adams, Steven Tyler and Joe Perry of Aerosmith, Sara Bareilles, Jonathan Colton, Alex Ebert of Edward Sharpe and the Magnetic Zeros, Flaming Lips, Lady A, Cyndi Lauper, John Legend, Panic at the Disco, Plain White T's, They Might Be Giants. I feel like I'm doing a shout out to like my Patreon members. Thanks for your support, guys. God, I can't believe John Legend follows me on Patreon. I don't have a Patreon, by the way. Should I get that? How does it even work? Anyway, SpongeBob had a ridiculous amount of writers, which I think actually ended up diluting the desired effect of star casting. and I doubt that it made for a cohesive soundtrack. But I haven't seen or listened to it yet, so I can't really voice any opinions at this point. Look, I have no issue with producers hiring pop stars as a marketing strategy. I get it. It's currently very hard to get people into theaters due to the popularity of streaming services and the ever-rising cost of living. But annoyingly though, this attempt at rejuvenating the art form might actually be the thing that causes its demise in the long run. Just like Jaws and Star Wars, both groundbreaking films, helped to create the concept of the summer blockbuster, which has come to dominate the movie industry to the point that serious films are now somewhat of a niche. Just like that, musicals written by pop stars becoming the norm destroys every opportunity for talented, hardworking composers who are unknown. The biggest downside to this shift on an individual level is, of course, that these talented composers can no longer make their living through writing music. But when we view the effect of this trend on the broader musical theatre landscape, it has the potential to severely harm the already quite divisive reputation. As discussed, the pop star to musical writer pipeline can be triumphant, but there is no guarantee. So when pop stars bring in a high influx of new audiences, only for them to be disappointed by a bad show, it just reinforces this idea of, I don't like musicals. I've spoken about this a bit in my video on Wonka, but this idea that anybody who can write music can write a musical is frankly naive and ultimately damaging to the reputation of musical theatre. In case you're not aware, the songs of the movie musical starring Timothée Chalamet were written by Neil Hannon, the frontman of chamber pop group, whatever that is, The Divine Comedy. According to his Wikipedia, Neil has written everything from theme tunes to opera to a cricket-themed pop album. The insect or the sport? Or both? But he, according to his Wikipedia page at least, has no prior experience writing musicals. Something which I personally felt whilst watching the film. For me, the songs lacked an overarching vision. He establishes a sound world in the first few songs to convey Wonka's whimsical world, but then completely relinquishes it in later songs. And not in a way where narratively it would make sense to veer into new territory, but simply because that's what he came up with for that song. At least that's the way it came across to me. Where are the reoccurring themes, or the leitmotifs for the well-versed amongst us? And the few melodies that do get repeated, what do they represent? What is their narrative purpose? These are all things that a more seasoned collaborator could have guided him in, to make sure the music doesn't feel as shallow. But alas, no one on the creative team had a musical theatre background. And that, quite frankly, sucks. Movie musicals, despite being quite a different medium, seeing you take away the life aspect, is still an excellent way to promote live musical theatre to the masses. Cinema tickets are way cheaper than theatre tickets, which lowers that threshold to potentially try out something new. But when there are only a few movie musicals being produced each year, and so only a few chances to convince people to support live theatre, it's a shame that it's not an accurate representation of the quality that an audience can expect from a live theatre show. And I fear the same phenomenon will become more and more prevalent with the rise of the pop star musicals. Solely relying on star casting to sell your show is a short-sighted marketing strategy. By focusing on short-term solutions without putting in place the elements that will translate it to a long-term success, you're essentially setting yourself up to get trapped in a cycle. The truth is that the only way to combat the I don't like musicals mindset is by making a very good musical. So I guess I'm proposing that the only pop stars who should be allowed to write musicals are the ones who know the difference between a buffalo and a time step. This brings me back to the start of the video, Katie Tunstall writing the musical adaptation of Clueless. Do I have high expectations for this production? Well, the elements that seem to come back time and time again in our success stories seem to be 1, a prior love for the art form / a natural flamboyance, and 2, a well-seasoned collaborator to guide the newcomer. Katie has expressed in an interview that she does qualify for the former category, and from the announcement we can also confirm that she is surrounded by veterans, so at least the right ingredients are present for a home run. Although I wasn't a fan of the sneak peek that they released. You can be well anything you choose. That's not at all how I imagined a musical adaptation of Clueless. But hey, the theater is the best environment to take bold risks, so I'm ready to be completely flabbergasted by their fresh new take. Unfortunately, I will have to wait until February, so I guess in the meantime, the original film and the Jane Austen novel that it was based on, Emma, those ones will have to keep me sweet until then. I would love to hear you guys' thoughts about this. Are you a fan of this trend, or are you more of a cynic like I am? Which shows did I miss out? Because I'm sure I missed quite a few. Thank you so much, by the way, for the love on my recent video about the Beetlejuice sequel, and I will be back soon with more musical theater video essays. Bye!